Hello, this is Moni Castaneda, and today I would like to chat with you about manifesting without using the law of attraction. In this video, I want to share with you my first experience manifesting, my first experience thinking that something that I saw in the world was not right, and me just having the intention to change it and it changing. And it happened when I was 8 years old. And so in case you haven't met me before, my name is Moni and I'm a feng shui consultant and teacher. And feng shui is one of the most powerful manifesting tools. But this video is not about feng shui. This video is about my first experience manifesting, and I would like for you to also share with me what was your first experience manifesting something. And so I was 8 years old, and something happens, at 8 years old, there's this huge brain development in a child. Before the age of 8, a child has a really hard time distinguishing what is true from what is fiction. And so, for example, children who are younger than 8 years old, they will see something on TV and they'll ask their parents, is that real? Is that really happening? Or is that just a story? And so something really important happens for an 8-year-old child in their brain. And that's probably, it was probably at the time that happened to me that I started noticing certain things. So there were two areas of stress in my life when I was 8 years old. And one of them was two of my favorite aunt and uncle, they would argue a lot. And the other source was my father. My father was very abusive, and he, there's not a time in my whole life when I remember not being afraid of my father. But until I was about 8 years old, the abuse was physical. There was a lot of spanking and hitting with the belt, and but when I turned 8 years old, the psychological, emotional abuse started. And so these were my two causes of stress, right? My aunt and uncle fighting, and they were siblings, right? And my father being irrational. And so I remember that my aunt and uncle, my aunt, she was at least, I think, 14 years older than my uncle. And this was the 70s. And this was a time when clothing started becoming unisex. And they had these horrible fights. Because my aunt, she was short, but she had like huge boobs. It's like she kind of looked like Dolly Parton, but with bigger boobs. And my uncle, he was tall and athletic, with broad shoulders. And they had decided that each of them, on their own, had decided that they could put on each other's clothes. And so my aunt had bought this collection of tops that were like A-shaped and that had paisleys, which were really popular in the 70s, kind of like the hippie look. And my uncle, would wear his bell bottoms, and he had big hair and all that. And so he would go and put on her tops to get this kind of androgynous look, right? And then when he returned them, because he was so tall and athletic, he would have deformed the shoulders. And then they were just flop on the shoulders of my aunt. But also my aunt, he had these beautiful knit sweaters that he liked to wear, and they were like tapered to his body. And so my aunt would go to his closet and grab his sweaters and put them on, and she had these huge boobs, right? So the next time he tried to put on his sweaters, they had these drapes in the front, and they actually looked very funny. But they would have these horrible fights. They really scared me. Because they lived across from us. My grandmother's house was across from us, and so we would go visit them often, and they'd be arguing about these things, and I just couldn't understand why my aunt and uncle could not see that every time they borrowed the clothes from the other person, it was gonna end up poorly in these really bad arguments, right? And so I remember being 8 years old and looking at that and thinking, this is absurd and this needs to stop. They need to understand the consequences of the choices they are making. And they stopped arguing. My uncle stopped borrowing my aunt's tops. My aunt stopped borrowing his sweaters. And they started getting along a lot better, and even making jokes and laughing at each other's jokes. And I was like, wow, I just wish for something to happen. And it happened. And so then I thought, well, this kind of success, how about I try it with my dad? And so I remember just looking at my dad, and he was having some other kind of irrational behavior. That was one of the things that upset me so much about my father, is that not that he wasn't just abusive, but he was completely irrational. You never knew what could tick him off. You never knew what that trigger was going to be by which he exploded. And so his reactions were not ever proportionate to whatever the situation was. And so I remember looking at my father and thinking, you have to start being more rational. And your reactions need to be in proportion to what just happened. You need to think about this logically. And then, within a couple of days, my father started acting rationally. And it went along for about a week, and he was like a different person. He was being kind, and he was being nice to people. He was just being rational. So in the beginning, as an 8-year-old, I'm like, I just wish for these two things to happen. And they happened. And I knew that it was related to something I did, and it scared me so much. In a way, it scared me to think, oh, I could have that much power? Could I have that much power? And it also angered me, because then I thought, I don't want my father to be nice to him because he's being, at some level, being manipulated as if he was a puppet or a marionette. I want him to be good to me because that's the right thing to do. And I remember getting so angry, and I remember thinking, what kind of a joke is this life? What kind of a joke is this reality? Somebody playing a trick on me? If it's so easy for these people to start behaving rationally, why aren't they behaving rationally? And I was so upset that I stopped manifesting completely in my life. I stopped being a co-creator of my own reality. And just like they were, because the reason my intent alone was able to produce these changes in them is because they were not creating a reality for themselves. They were just living like leaves in the wind. And so I was so scared and so angry that I stopped manifesting, and for the next 10 years until I turned 18, my life was hell. It really was hell. Fortunately, if you have read my book, Room by Room, Feng Shui Secrets for a Happy Life, I think I have a copy nearby. Yeah, that's my new book, Room by Room, Feng Shui Secrets for a Happy Life. You will see the only reason I did not be insane is that I had a wonderful grandmother and a very loving extended family, but my nuclear family, with such an abusive parent, was hell. And so it took me many years. It was until many years later, when I was probably in my 20s, and I had started hanging out with people who were into spiritual things and that understood about manifesting, that I finally understood what had happened, right? And then I started realizing, okay, I need to start being a script writer of the script of my life. I can't just leave things, just to happen randomly. And what I would like for you to share with me is, I would like for you to share with me what was your first experience manifesting. And when you were a child, did you have an experience? Where you just wished for something to happen, or you had a strong intent for something to happen and it happened? I would love to hear that story from you. And I'm also going to record the video with my children. They're 13 and 16 right now. They're teenagers. And they are going to share with you their first experiences of manifesting. And of course, because they are being raised in a home with lots of love and care and respect, they are much better at it than most people I know, definitely much better at it than me or my husband. And so I'm going to be sharing those experiences of my children's manifesting with you. Now, when I was a child, it was pure intent that made these things happen. It was my pure intent. I was not using the law of attraction, the way it's being taught. I was not visualizing something. I was not working with affirmations. I was not putting my emotions around it to feel like it's real happening right now. And so the only thing I did is I made a decision. Many years later, I would learn that one of the fastest, more direct ways to manifest something is to make a decision. But we'll talk more about that in future videos. Thank you so much for watching.